Thank you very much, David, and it's great to be back here, and Alan, thank you for this, Athene, thank you for this, people I've known from past lives. And it's interesting to have a chance to talk about this. When I was the MP, I used to give lots of tours of Parliament, and you can see in the way the building works where power is sat. So I don't know how many of you have done the full tour of Parliament, but you start off with the royal chambers at one end, where the monarch was in charge, and that's where power went. As you keep going, you get to the House of Lords, where power sat for a very long time. Keep going, you get to the House of Commons. Keep going, you get to the road and Tesco's. I always thought that really does say it all about how we are seeing the transition. Now, we've spoken about lots of ideas here, and going third is always difficult because so many interesting and important things have been said. And I'm going to try very hard not to say all the things that were just talked about. There's lots more that we could cover and will later. I think there is a lot to be said about how the way that we do politics in this country has led to the decline of trust. There's no doubt that lack of trust, I'll come back to some ramifications of that later, has been a problem. And the pettiness, I'm always reminded, probably my first year, late in my first year as an MP, there was a debate about youth unemployment. And every single speaker from the opposition benches said, youth unemployment is far too high and it's the government's fault. And every single speaker from the government benches said, youth unemployment is too high and it's the last government's fault. Nobody said anything about what we should do about it, because that's too hard. Far, far more important to actually point the finger of blame to other people. Incidentally, David Miliband gave a speech a bit after that where he did try and tackle it, which was very good. But we also have an issue with the difficulty of change, that things are more and more complex. We don't really know how to do it. One of the things that I've done since losing is to join the clinical commissioning group here in Cambridgeshire and Peterborough. We commission healthcare services, spend out £950 million a year, trying to provide healthcare for people here in Cambridgeshire and Peterborough. We are the biggest in the country by population, far from the biggest in the country by amount of money we have to spend, which is part of the problem. And one thing it's made me realise is that pretty much every speech I heard from pretty much anybody about the NHS missed the point. It's too hard, so people find somewhere where they can actually draw a dividing line and work out who's on which side of it, rather than tackle the real challenges. Now, there's two things I particularly want to try and talk about that I don't think we've touched on quite, and one of those is about nuance, and one of those is about strained coalitions. Let me start with the coalitions, and I don't just mean the Lib Dem Conservative coalition that we've just had, though there were a couple of strains in that at times. But we're seeing this throughout politics, that the organisations which were there, the parties and other units, are breaking apart and struggling. And so leadership, to me at least, seems to become more and more an exercise in not losing your own people along the way, rather than showing where to go. And there's a huge tension between the pragmatists, people who want to change policy directly, the purists who want to argue clear positions without compromises. And we can talk about ideas like the Overton window and how that works. Ed Miliband spent a huge amount of his time working out policy positions on many issues that wouldn't lose people either from the right or the left. And so policy was often devised based on that. We can see how that's now completely fallen apart in the Labour Party with Corbyn, who very much isn't able to hold everybody together. There's a separate issue here, I'll come on to this in nuance as well. Labour spent 5 years arguing that there were two sides. There was the side of good and there was the side of evil. People like Lib Dems like myself were clearly on the side of evil because we were working with the Conservatives. And then when there was a leadership contest, most of the candidates tried to explain that there was nuance. And they discovered that spending 5 years saying there wasn't any and then explaining there was very tricky to do. So Ed Miliband struggled with that. And we saw the same thing with David Cameron. If you look, for example, at European policy, time and time again, he was driven into short-term tactical positions to avoid problems with Eurosceptics and UKIP. We're now in a long-term position which was not designed, but we reached in separate ways. Another comment on Cameron, I was always interested in what he was trying to lead people to. I have to say, I think he's very much the sort of person who believes that he's the sort of person who should be in charge, rather than having a vision about where he wants to be. That's the leadership as person in power. I see a grin there. I won't quote you on it. We see similar tension by some of the other parties. The Greens have this huge split between the more socialist Greens and the environmental Greens, who have very, very different aims. UKIP have a split. Are they a right-wing party? Are they trying to pick up the working class they feel Labour has left behind? Patrick O'Flynn has a very different view to Nigel Farage. We had our own issues. The SNP, remarkably, have managed to occupy a position where they are both in government and an anti-government force. And it's really remarkable how many people voted in Scotland for the SNP because health and education in Scotland was simply not good enough. And we see this around the rest of the world. We can see the European Union as a coalition that's falling apart, Republicans and Democrats, Australian parties as well. So that's the problem of strained coalitions. How do you keep people together and provide some momentum as well? And it's complicated particularly by nuance, because public policy, interesting public policy, is really hard. We have some of the students from the MPP programme. None of it's easy. Good, I'm glad they've realised that. Now, some things are, you could talk about the death penalty. That could be a fairly easy thing. But lots of other things are much, much, much more complex. But we keep trying to simplify them and make out that there is two sides, a very simple space, and that causes problems. And you couple that with echo chambers, and that makes it much, much worse. And then you take a political position we have now where you don't need to get mass support in order to win. We've now reached the stage where about 36% is enough to get majority government. And other than the House of Lords being difficult, you can then do anything that you like. And if you only need to get about a third of the votes to get a majority, you can afford to ignore and alienate 60% of the electorate, because it doesn't matter. I mean, I'd be happy with 36% for Lib Dems, but, but so people just aim the comments at the people that they need to get in order to win. And that means that echo chamber is really bad. Social media is brilliant. I'm a huge advocate of Twitter. I was, in the last parliament, the first of the MPs to have actually been on Twitter before I was one. But it really creates echo chambers. People talk to each other all the time. We saw this in the AV referendum. The AV referendum had campaigns and messages which are absolutely brilliant and persuasive if you believed in AV. And they were tested out on other people on Twitter who also had believed in AV, and nobody else. They didn't persuade anybody else. There's a lot of research on this. There's a brilliant book, Jane's Probability Theory, The Logic of Science, really goes into some of this. Every other page is technical, just skip those pages, the rest of it's quite readable. People listen to messages and believe messages from those they already believe, and people segment more and more. And we had a debate, Laura and I, rather bravely I think, did a debate against UKIP. And Patrick O'Flynn, I've done two of them. One of them in Cambridge, where it was about 300 in favour of staying in, 6 against. One in Peterborough, where it was something like 250 to 16. But what was interesting... The other way, yes, exactly. But what was interesting about it was a great example of how it is impossible to have a conversation with some of these people. Most of the audience were UKIP members, I believe, UKIP activists. And anything that they didn't agree with, that didn't support their view, they would deride and shout down as a lie. Mm-hmm. Anything. A survey I mentioned was a lie. I mean, it was flawed, it was a survey. They're all, there's problems with all surveys. The most remarkable one, it's good to have Laura here again, was at one point somebody said, there is no way that Churchill would have stood for any of this European stuff. Laura pointed out that he was one of the founders of the European movement, which got this tirade of, that's a lie. And it's very, very hard to persuade anybody of something if they are that far away that they will deride anything as a lie. And this feeds back into the disaffection. I could say a lot more about social media, the roles, and how accuracy is rather less good, because messages can pass around so fast without any fact-checking. And any other process of oversimplification also feeds back. Any time an organisation like They Work For You, trying to do very good things, tries to capture an entire debate into a for something or against something, it's missed a lot of the nuance which can heavily mislead people. The last thing I'll say before I finish was about 38 Degrees, because I think they're a really interesting example. Are you familiar with 38 Degrees, the sort of online campaigning site? And they were set up with the very best of intentions. They really were. David Babbs had a really good idea about trying to engage the public, something we should be trying to do. And they did very well. There are problems with getting people to sign petitions. People often sign things without reading them. I used to chair the Cambridge Traffic Management Committee, and it was always interesting to see how many people would have signed a petition for and against a particular measure. But the problem they had is they grew very fast. They needed to get money in order to keep paying their staff. And you can't get money by saying, here is a complex issue, here's some information about either side, make your own mind up. Oh, and give us some money. And so increasingly they've been forced into a position of saying, this thing will be the end of all that is good in the country, or this is essential to save everything, this will destroy the NHS, this will create the NHS, whatever it is. It has to be absolutely cataclysmic so that they can get the money that's needed to keep going. This isn't just about 38 Degrees, it's about many of the campaigning organisations that actually need to have that thing that is evil so that they can be the people who are good. And that, I think, fosters even more of this segregation, which was involved with some of the Corbyn issues. The last election I found deeply frustrating, not just because I didn't win, but because the election became about who did you distrust more. The question was, do you distrust Ed Miliband and the SNP, or do you distrust David Cameron? We weren't the answer to that question, which is why we did particularly so bad, one of the reasons we did so badly. But it's really depressing we've got to that stage. So how do we get to true leadership that actually keeps values, that actually works in reality, that holds people together, and that resonates with the public and reaches out broadly? I don't really have a good answer to that, but I can see some of the problems. Thanks.